Welcome back to the Village Bonfire for another episode of the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. A podcast not just for your mind, but for your body and spirit too. Here we don't just talk theory. Instead, we compassionately engage with our lived experiences and a wide variety of topics together, all to invite the question, in these times we find ourselves in, how do we be more human? Thank you for being here. May these conversations awaken, inspire, repair, and evolve something deep within each of us and serve the wild, tender aliveness of our personal and collective hearts.
Welcome back to another episode of the Wild Sacred Journey podcast. And as you can probably hear, this one's a few days late because I'm getting over kind of a nasty cold. And so that's actually part of what I'm going to speak to today is this this phenomenon of after kind of a peak experience of getting sick. And so for those of you who might sort of be newer or be tuning in, I just got back to the United States, or what's currently known as the United States, after a 4-month basically pilgrimage in Scotland and Ireland. And so I'll get more kind of into what I mean by peak experiences and what I mean more about this phenomenon of getting sick afterwards in just a moment. But yeah, I felt like, well, I'm really in the thick of it. And this is something that I see sometimes happen with clients, particularly new clients. And, of course, there's like the actual like physical immune system basis for what's happening. But then there's also actually a more like spiritual and energetic component as well to this phenomenon. And that's the part that I see not getting tended to a whole lot. And so, I felt like this might be while I'm kind of in the thick of it. And just is very fresh for me. It felt like a good time to invite you into that conversation. So before we dive in, I'll go ahead and light our candle here, our village fire. Mm. And if you tuned in to the last episode, you might have seen me sort of change the overhead lights and all of that. And I'm really, really feeling how this time of the year here around the winter solstice is really this space of being with the fire, but being with the fire from the darkness, Um, yeah. So from that quiet, dark space, if we imagine stepping from that darkness to the fire, just take a few deep breaths in and out. And even if you're imagining yourself facing the fire, let yourself be aware of the quiet depths of winter around you. There's a simplicity, a bare bonesedness, not sure, to this time, like a paring down and essentialism. And that feels very counter, perhaps, to the holiday season. And so we just acknowledge the and space of that. It's a both and situation. And so I'm aware too, like this time around the solstice is actually like, it's like the bottom of the exhale. And so there's a breath practice that in English we call square breathing, which explores, it's like inhaling for a certain count, holding at full at a certain count, exhaling for that same count, and then holding empty for the same count. So it's just, create a square, it's all the same count. And with that, I part of what I love about that breath is it gives me a way of tuning in. How am I in relationship right now with the extremes and with the spaces in between them? And so it's interesting because I'll sometimes have clients explore that breath practice for a moment. And it kind of helps illuminate the patterns of like, is my system more comfortable at the extremes? Is my system more comfortable empty and kind of almost maybe collapsed? Is my system more comfortable full and sort of activated? Is my system more comfortable in the spaces between, or is my system not at all comfortable in the spaces between? So it gives us a lot of information. And so we see that too, then, like, that shows up in our lives, it shows up in our body, it shows up in our relationships, it shows up in everything, right? Those patterns. But then it also kind of shows us like where actually in the cycle of the year we might find ourselves kind of more familiar or more comfortable. And so here in this solstice, this bottom of the exhale, it's like, can we like settle into sort of the deathness of that, the endings of that, the closings of things, the absence of things? And do we have the skills and the capacity to be with the grief that might come up with that, or the fear, or whatever all else might be there? Or maybe that has become a comfortable place. Or maybe that's a comfortable place, but more in a numb way and not necessarily in something that feels still vital, if that makes sense. And maybe we don't know. And that's just like something we sit with in curiosity. But just knowing that we're in this space right now collectively in sort of the cycle of the world, where the inhale is slowly, slowly starting to happen. But sometimes too, if we're not comfortable with that bottom of the exhale place, it's like, or we're kind of in it too long for our current capacity, then it's like we rush to inhale, right? And yet that's not actually how the seasons work. There's going to be a slow build, and it's going to build, and then there's going to be that slow decline again, right? And so yeah, so I don't know, I just feel called to kind of offer that because holidays can be surprisingly full of grief and or maybe unsurprisingly for some people, but I think sometimes it's easy to forget that there's also this rhythm happening in the world around us that our bodies are attuned to, that our nervous systems are responding to on some level, whether we're conscious of it or not. And so where our overculture and our society are expecting us, or we're expecting ourselves through what we're used to kind of be operating at a certain level, it's often good to kind of check in and be like, okay, but what's happening in the natural world? Because that's probably more what my body's aligned with. So yeah. So okay. So yeah. So integration and getting sick after a peak experience is kind of what I was, going to speak to today. So I think a place to start with that is what is, and you're kind of, like I said, you're getting me like in the middle of it. Like yesterday was the first day I was able to shower in a while. I'm able to sit up for like more than 30 seconds before having to lay back down again. My voice is still rough, as you can probably hear, but it's not as bad as it was. And so here we are. My brain feels clear enough that I think I'll be able to hold the threads of this conversation. So I figure we'll give it a try. So yeah. So what is a peak experience? So when I talk about peak experiences, and I'm not the only person to be saying these sorts of things. I want to be clear about that. And I'm not the first person to be saying these sorts of things, but I don't feel like they're getting talked about enough in most spaces. And so anyway, I'm here to share my experience with all of this. So peak experience. So peak experience could be a retreat. It could be a ceremony or a plant medicine ceremony. It could be, meditation practice or a breathwork practice or a yoga asana practice or, some other sort of, it could be a really deeply connected spiritual sexual experience. Like it could be a whole range of things. It could be a really good meal with like really good friends, right? But it's those moments where our mundane reality sort of falls away and we kind of reach this very expansive, very heart open, very at one with the universe kind of space. And so those can be small, like acute moments or experiences, or it could be something more extended. So getting into longer term retreats or pilgrimages, right? Or something like that. And so in those moments, what we've done is we've taken ourselves out of our day-to-day sort of experience for a moment, and we've tapped into something else. And like I said, usually there's sort of a sense of high after that, right? There's like a sense of, oh my gosh, everything's connected, everything's love, everything's expanded, you know, and there's this sense of like, I have figured out what it is, like the secret of the universe. I am here, I am evolved, I've got it, right? And like, this is it. This is the truth, capital T, the answer, right? And so because of that, like that's like a really heady, heady, beautiful space to be in, right? We could be anybody. We can reinvent ourselves in this moment. Like the possibilities are endless, right? And so it can also be easy to get addicted or habituated or to want to seek those out, right? And so then we go like, it can be really easy, especially in our sort of over culture trained society of like more, progress, better, peak, that we just kind of keep seeking the highs, keep seeking the highs, right? And so, but real life is waiting, right? And like I just talked about with the solstices and like the seasonal cycles and, and even, I mean, gosh, our breath, right? Like inhale. I mean, feel that for a moment. Feel the expansion of that. Exhale. Oh, a natural contraction. Inhale. Oh, expansion. Exhale. Oh, contraction, right? We are wired for expansion and contraction. We are wired for rupture and repair, right? We are wired for cycles, complete cycles. So to be constantly chasing peak experiences without the contraction, without the integration, means we're not actually metabolizing. We're not actually taking in. And so this is like a really, I think, important piece for us to kind of acknowledge, because I think it really helps us too in discerning which teachers, mentors, guides, or which opportunities and experiences we're kind of seeking out. Because there's a lot in the wellness world right now that is actually about escapism, right? And that constant seeking, like I use the example all the time back when I used to facilitate yoga asana practices for people. Like, are we coming on our mats to avoid our lives, or are we coming on our mats to step out of our lives for a moment so we can kind of tune in, take stock, and practice the skills we need to then go off our mats back into our lives and actually be more skillful humans in our lives, right? Are we going to these retreats to escape our lives? Or are we going to these retreats to tend to ourselves in a way that helps us build skill and build capacity to be a more whole human in our lives, a more whole, skillful, intact human in our lives, right? And so I think that's like an important piece of this, right? The discerning between escapism versus, I don't always love the word transformation, but yeah, maybe it's transformation, or maybe it's just, yeah, that wholeness, that intactness, that skill building, right? So yeah, so I think that's an important part in looking at kind of these peak experiences. You know, another piece of this too, I love the concept of safe and brave spaces, which I first read about, attributed to Brian. I'm not actually 100% sure how to pronounce his last name, Arao, Arao, and Christy Clemens. And so safe spaces being spaces that we go to where some trigger or some aspect of our lives, which is a source of pain or conflict or challenge for us, right, is not present. And through that, then we can start to tend to the parts of ourselves that are maybe too vulnerable or too unsafe feeling in that situation to be tended to. And outside of the influence of the challenge, the conflict, the trauma, whatever we want to call it, right? The trigger, outside of that influence, we can start to tend and repair and build skill, right? So sometimes that's a really important space to have. But again, that question, where do we then go with that? Because life is never going to be easy. It's never going to be free of conflict and tension, nor actually should it be, because evolution happens when something encounters something else that it can't process, can't metabolize, can't grow with easily. So, in the same way that we're wired for expansion and contraction, for rupture repair, we're wired. That's what rupture and repair is. We're wired for conflict and growth, conflict, growth, right? So that's where brave spaces start to come in. So brave spaces are actually the space. And again, this is my understanding based on what I read and how it feels in my body. But brave spaces are spaces where we have enough safety that we can take some risk. We have enough capacity that we can take some risk. We have enough commitment to each other and to the ongoing process between us where we can take some risk. And from there, we take the risk and we look at, okay, where am I having trouble expanding right now in this space with other people? Where is something feeling extra tender? And how can I start to take care of that in real time, in relationship with things and situations that may not be ideal or my ideal? And so we need those spaces too, because that's where we actually put these things into practice. So how does this kind of tie back to peak experiences? So again, peak experiences are these moments where we kind of somehow step out of mundane reality of our lives and we have this big expansive opening. Now, maybe that happens in a safe space. And then the question becomes, okay, well, great. Am I going to live in a bubble for the rest of my life where there's only these certain specific criteria? Or am I going to actually enter into the work that takes a lot of bravery and courage and a certain capacity for risk, which we may or may not have at that time? And so that's something we need to tend to. And that might require a professional or, some sort of practitioner to help us tend to that, right? But how do I start to bring what's happened in this peak experience, the version of me I discovered, the the new perception on the universe or on myself or on my relationships with others that I've discovered, that how do I bring that into my life? And how does it hold up when things are not always ideal, or when, when the details of the day-to-day are happening. And I'm tired and I didn't eat enough and I didn't really want to go to work, but I had to, and the bills are due and the car won't start, and, right? Like those things. And so that's like, so for me, that feels like that's also sort of this question of like, are we seeking peak experience after peak experience because it's like this bubble and this safety and this escapism? Or are we able to start to bring that into our lives? And so that's what, when I think integration is becoming more of a big word in the wellness spaces and in the ceremonial and plant medicine spaces and things. And I think that's really important, because that integration is the part where it's like, okay, great. I've like had my eyes opened. I had this flash of insight in this one moment. So many things became clear. Now, what does that look like? How do I bring that into my body? How do I actually live that? How do I, be it in my life? And so it's not uncommon after a peak experience, when we're being invited, whether consciously or not, into the integration space, for our body to experience physical symptoms. Now, again, of course, there are actual physical, immune system, biology, explanations for that. There's germs, there's stress, there's this, there's that, right? So yes, of course, all of that. And there's also the spiritual energetic component of it, which is oftentimes the frequency or that new way of being that we've discovered meeting our lives creates such the mundane lives creates such a it creates just there's such a clash, maybe, or a shock to the system, that it's like one of the only things our body can do is actually like shut down. And then through that, the integration can start to kind of happen on a physical level. And sometimes it needs our conscious minds, the ones that would make different choices, like not resting or not integrating, to actually like not even have a choice, right? Sometimes it might also be, when I first started doing my training, my integrative energetic medicine and coaching training, it was like after every one of our weekends where we would meet each month, I would be on the sofa for like 3 days with total flu symptoms, like out of nowhere. Like I feel fine over the weekend. I'd go home the next morning, I'd wake up, my body would be aching and shaky and my muscles would be sore. And I would just need to like lay there and sleep for like 3 days. And that happened for like 3 or 4 months. And then that began to stop happening. So sometimes too, it can be a sign, I think for me in some those moments, I suspect some of it's that the expansion that was happening I was not titrating that enough. I was taking in too much. I wanted to fix it all right then and there. And I was actually like pushing my own nervous system beyond its current capacity for change, for shift. And so I was seeing kind of an extreme backlash to that. Sometimes it can be, that we just need to rest and kind of shut off. Sometimes it can be that if there's been a lot of freeze response in our system, a lot that hasn't been moving, that then it's like when it starts to move, that can, feel really wobbly in our system, which can be the shakiness, right, that we might be feeling physically. So, there's different subtle layers of what might be happening, and it might mean slightly different things to each person, depending on the circumstance and what your system was like going into it and what the experience was for you, how titrated the experience was, how titrated we let the experience be for ourselves, that sort of thing. But I see that happen too sometimes with clients who come to me who are, either newer to this kind of work, or whose systems have been in a deep freeze, or who have a pattern of, more, right? That being used to the peak. Okay, well, what's next? Okay, well, what's next? And especially when I was a newer practitioner, I was not always very good, because that was a similar pattern to mine. I was not always very great at kind of recognizing those signals and actually helping the client pump the brakes for themselves. So that's something I've definitely gotten better at as a practitioner, I think. So I see less of that happening with some of my clients now, but sometimes it happens, and sometimes it just needs to happen. And so, the question then kind of becomes, how do we work with it, right? If you've had some sort of peak experience and then you're not feeling great afterwards, again, yes, get the physical checked out if necessary, tend to that, of course, if that's like, if that's how you need to go. But then as we're kind of able to tend to it, like, it's so quick when that starts to happen, right? For our brain to start to go to like, oh my God, what's wrong? Like, okay, I got to fix it. I need to rest, and I need to take this pill, and I should do this supplement, and I should do this is supposed to be good for the immune system. So I'm going to drink this tea, and I'm going to, right. And it's like, we're like looking for all the like doings. And again, within reason, yes, tend to your physical. Absolutely. 100%. You need medicine, take it. You need your herbal tea, drink it, right? But then there's also the question of like, what if, because your immune system is more in a fight response, right? So we tend to also then mirror that by, like, I know for me, when I'm not feeling well, like, there's part of me that's like, blah. But then when I'm like, not just like laying there half dead, I'm like ready to fight. I get irritated about everything. And it's so like at the surface, I'm so resistant. I'm like, all the things I could be doing if I weren't here. Right. And so I'll catch myself and be like, okay, well, there's a reason this is happening. Right. And what if I actually just surrendered to it for a moment, or like leaned into it just gently, And so what I find for that is, it's like, okay, if my body wants to shake, what if I let my body shake? Right. Because I feel like too, I find myself, and maybe you're like this too, of like wanting to perform betterness as if that will somehow like have me be better. Like, no, I'm not sniffy, like, no, I don't need to cough, suppressing the cough. No, I don't, and it's like, again, what if we let our system come into coherence? Like, I'm not feeling well, so I'm going to lay here. My body wants to shake. Okay, I'm going to let my body shake. My body wants to cough. Okay, I'm going to let my body cough, like cover your mouth, that kind of thing. But like, and like, let yourself, and again, not like necessarily being a total, like, like victim to it, right? Like we're not like, oh, woe is me, I'm going to die. Like, that's not helpful either. But just like okay, this is where we are. I'm here. I'm here. I'm here. And so, yeah, so that's one piece that I find myself having to like kind of remind myself of, right? If that feels beyond your current capacity or skill set, if you're newer to work like this, and you're finding and this conversation's resonating, and you're like, oh my God, that's exactly what's been happening to me, right? You might actually need to reach out to a practitioner, maybe the one you're seeing, whatever. It's funny to me how many times clients like will tell me like weeks later, like, oh yeah, I had one client who'd been working with me for months, and she was like, oh, I don't know. I'm always so like, I really like our sessions, but I also like, I'm always nervous going into them because I always like feel really poorly afterwards. And I'm like, oh, well, that's actually connected probably. And so let me know next time that happens, because we can actually work with that, and we can help you move through that, and we can help kind of tend to that. Like, I didn't even know that was happening, And so I, as the practitioner, then can't be giving you tools or helping you have some context for what's happening that will help you integrate it, process it, metabolize it, move through it, move forward, right? So, communicating with your practitioner, or finding a practitioner, or getting some support if you need it. And again, if you're in the middle of really not feeling well and you don't yet have a practitioner, that might feel daunting. So let the worst of it pass and then kind of find somebody. The other piece too, that I would say, pay attention to the symbolism, right? I think a lot of times we're taught to kind of poo-poo that, like, oh, you can make meaning out of anything. You can find meaning in anything. And it's like, yeah, but also sometimes, and by sometimes, I mean pretty much all the time, our symbolism is a way that the more subtle, slightly like on the very outer edges of our consciousness is like trying to come more into like our more day-to-day consciousness, right? So there's like a way that messages start to come through, like what's the lesson here, like what's, and again, like not in an over analysis kind of way. Like, I think it's really easy to get into this, like, what is the meaning in this, what is the message in this? Like, sometimes we're just sick, right? And there's usually something there we can notice. Like, our patterns are always there. So without kind of this like heavy neon light analysis gaze, right? But with more of this like gentle flickering candlelight kind of gaze, we just sort of get curious, right? So most recently, I came back from my 4 months in Scotland and Ireland. And like literally 2 days later, I was like, uh-oh, my throat's sore. Uh-oh, here we go. And then I slept for like 2 days. And so I was curious, because I was like, okay, what are the symptoms here? Because I actually wasn't shaky physically. I wasn't like flu-like in that sense, like the muscle fatigue and things like that. But I was like it went right to my sinuses and my throat. And so symbolically, there was stuff about congestion, not feeling like I could breathe, not feeling like I had any room, which, the room I stay in here at my parents' house is like, it's basically like my own storage unit that happens to have a bed in it. And I often feel like I can't breathe in that room, and like I can't, I don't have any room. And so I just been on this big, expansive, like moving all the time and living really minimally and having minimal stuff like on this trip. And then I came back and it was like, and like literally couldn't breathe and didn't feel like I had any room, right? Irritation, right? Irritation of the sinuses, like irritation was coming up a lot. I was feeling massively, massively like oversensitive. I have a, very high sensitivity. And so I was like definitely like laying there, and I'm in that state where I'm like, I can like feel the tree across the street moving, and I can like, and so I was in this very expanded state. And so a lot of things felt very like, yeah, felt very irritating. And again, I felt like kind of claustrophobic in that space. So like that was some of it. And I think the sleep was also just kind of like helping me kind of ground some of that a little bit. Deal, process and metabolize some of that without having to be fully conscious for all of that. So it kind of knocked me out a little. The throat, has a lot to do with our message and our way of sharing ourselves in the world and communicating with the world. And so, there was definitely like a need to kind of integrate as I'm coming back, right, from like all of this expansion and this discovery and this new, like being able to reinvent myself, and then I come back and I go right into like big family time and, the holidays and with people who've known me for a long time. Right. And love me dearly. And I love them. And, it's so easy for them to just be like, oh, you're back. And to just kind of be in this space of like, as assuming that I'm the same person I was when I left, because why wouldn't they assume that? That's just a normal human thing. And so, yeah, so that disconnect, that like roughness of the edge of like, oh, that's not me anymore. And I'm not even sure actually like some of those changes that we find in ourselves happening as we travel, we don't really get to even see what they are until we come back to people who are used to us being a certain way. And then we're like, oh, no, that doesn't feel right. And, we may not even have realized that thing had shifted for us. So there's that throat piece, right? There was also the first couple of days of it where I just felt like this huge weight was on my chest, right? Heart, lungs, grief, right? I was really grieving the end of my trip. Like really, like I still am, There were a lot of ways in which I was not ready for that to end. And yet, and so you come back and everybody celebrating and this and that, right? And it's like, yeah, and I'm just sitting there going like, whoa, like, yeah, there's a disconnect here between, yes, of course I love you and I'm happy to see you, but like also I'm really sad. And there's a lot in the world right now that's like very grief heavy, and there's a lot just of grief that comes up again naturally, I think, at this time of year, as part of the seasonal cycles. And yeah, so there was like, so as I kind of sat with the symbolism of my symptoms, like, yes, they're physical, and what's the symbolism of them, and just was curious with it, it was like, oh, okay, that's interesting to notice. Yes, that is probably some of what's happening here, right? So we can start to kind of pay attention to those things as a way of kind of cluing us in a little bit, right? And then know too that like your body, there's also this practice of like trusting the intelligence of your body, right? And so the other piece too is like my mind coming back, I was like, oh yeah, it's holidays, we're gonna make cookies, hang out with my family, we're gonna go see this and we're gonna go do that, and we're gonna, right? And like my system was like, we are actually too sensitive, too open, like too ungrounded, and have just been on this like mostly fairly solo pilgrimage for 4 months, and to come back right into like so much relationship and like togetherness and like doingness was like, it was actually too much. Right. And so some of the intelligence of my body just like shutting down in that way was that it was like, there were so many things that I ended up having to bow out of, because I was just not feeling up for it. And then the beauty was that then when my family left for a couple hours to go do those things, I got a couple hours to just be in the quiet, which I actually desperately needed. And I noticed each time, like my nervous system would just like down regulate, like several big rungs on the ladder. um, so, conscious mind, I would not have set those boundaries for myself or asked for that time, or felt even probably kind of entitled to give myself for that time, right? And yet my body knew that it needed it and went ahead and created a situation where it was more inevitable, and kind of more accepted and acceptable, And so that's then also something for me to note. Interesting. Like that's an important part of my integration process, actually. And so maybe next time I set up the situation so that I have more of those moments already ready for me, so my body doesn't need to get sick to give them to me. And so that's part of where then it's like, as we start to go through this, and as we start to recognize how we integrate and get more skillful at integration, it does actually get easier. And these types of the duration of the sick symptoms usually gets shorter. And oftentimes we don't actually need to get sick to integrate. And so, it happens less, because we get more skillful at it, and so I would say too, some of this is like, I actually am noticing that, I feel like the feedback I'm getting from my body and my soul in this moment is like, I did a pretty good job actually of integrating a lot of the lessons and a lot of these new ways of being that I was discovering on the trip, actually. And it was still just a massive, massive shift for me, that 4 months. And so, yeah, like it's only beginning, actually, and that's something I think we forget. We think the peak moment in the experience is the key of it. And really, that's actually more like the spark. And then it's like, but now if we want that fire to be lit, like that's when the work actually begins. The work begins after, that's really when the experience and the journey actually deepen in their richness. And it's only through letting ourselves actually metabolize what happened that we get to get all the nutrients from it, So, yeah. So let's see. Oh yeah. Well, I had it in my notes. I was going to offer, I don't know, part of me feels complete on this, but I guess let me just, um, yeah. Well, so one final example of that, I think, as I'm starting to, feel the completeness of this piece, I think for today anyway, is, when I was practicing yoga asana a lot more, sometimes I would suddenly find myself in an arm balance I had not thought I could do, or like, an inversion that I had not thought I could do, or some other like quote unquote peak pose, some other thing that had sort of a peakness in my mind because it was a challenge for me. And I would be like, oh my God, I can do it. I had no idea. Right. And then, of course, I would do it once, basically by accident, because I didn't really think I could do it or know I could do it. And then it was like, I wouldn't be able to do it again until I'd really worked at it for a really long time and practiced and really gotten into the nuance of something and really come to understand it, or, actually build up the intentional skills and understanding to be able to really own, prepared my body and my system to actually be able to really own it, if that made sense. And so, I think that's some of what this final piece that I was saying, the metabolizing of a peak experience, a lived experience is just a lived experience until we bring it down and in, and then it has the potential to become wisdom. Or, our truth, or a medicine we can share. Right. And so it takes time. It takes a slowness. It takes an apprenticeship, which goes back to some earlier podcast episodes that I think, that's a theme that comes up in these podcast episodes, right? It's like not rushing to, excuse me. Here we go. My body's telling me I've had enough talking. So not rushing to, rushing through a training and then rushing to monetize it and rushing to share it, right? Like we have to chew on it a while, let it digest, which is part of why I think I've been a lot quieter while I was on this journey, than maybe you expected of me, or than I even expected of me. So anyway, one other piece that I just kind of want to add, although it, ultimately I think this could become its whole other podcast episode, but this liminal space kind of between like the quote unquote ending of a peak experience and then the integration of it and the metabolizing of it is where ritual can help. And so, like I said, it's a whole other podcast episode. But sorry. um coughing attack there. So yeah, at its simplest, ritual is a practice of listening and being in relationship with or tending to a shared nervous system. That's kind of my like definition of that. And so again, I can really unpack that more in a whole other podcast episode. But what that means in this liminal space is, again, like I was saying earlier, we're kind of working with things like you've gone to this peak experience, you've had this insight, you're somehow connected in with this subtler understanding, this subtler perception, this subtler wisdom that isn't quite like tangible yet, right? Like it isn't quite in the daylight consciousness, right? It's sort of on the periphery of the edges. It's like in the flickering shadows of the candlelight, right? And it hasn't like fully stepped forward to really be illuminated by the flames, right? And so our, ritual and like archetypes or songs or stories or these other sort of ways of connecting to things that aren't bright light consciousness yet can help keep us kind of tuned into them while they're showing us then how they're going to land in our bodies or how they're going to ask us to step up to be able to steward them. And so, little plug here, but now until January 12th of 2024, I will be, and now being December 28th, I've got my tarot for 2024 offerings. And I'll have the link for that in the show notes, but you can find it on my website. If you go to www.wildsacredjourney.com and you look under the services tab, there's a Insight 2024, which is the different tarot offerings that I have. But that's a beautiful way because, again, here at the solstice, here at the new year, like we're actually in kind of these peak moments, like a peak. Sometimes the peak is the bottom too, right? Like that extreme. So the bottom of the exhale, right? And so there's like, what new thing wants to come forth for us in 2024? What path are we following that will help us like become that best version of ourselves or help us live as sort of this sense of who we are that we can't put into words or we can't even look at directly because we're not meant to see ourselves directly because we actually can't see ourselves directly. Like we literally can't. And so that's where having that kind of mirroring from outside sources can help. And particularly archetypes can be really potent spaces for that because the archetypes, the stories, the myths, the songs, whatever, they're still kind of connected to that on the edges and the flickering shadows of the candlelight consciousness, the wisdom and the awareness that is still kind of too subtle and too ephemeral for kind of that like full awareness. And so it's like the archetypes drop breadcrumbs, like frequency breadcrumbs. We can follow this like energetic trail. And as long as we can keep following that trail, it's like suddenly we find ourselves embodying the thing that we wanted to embody. And we're not totally sure how we got there. And it wasn't conscious choice because it was soul level. And so it needed to kind of come through sideways because soul usually comes through sideways or it kind of like comes in the back door, right? Like soul does not come in the front door because we've stared at it and analyzed it and made a conscious mental decision about things, right? Like that's just not the frequency that soul operates on. So if that's like speaking to you, head to the website through the link in the show notes, or like I said, www.wildsacredjourney.com, and the services tab will have Insight 2024, which is the tarot offerings. And so I deliver them by PDF. So it's not a live session. We don't have to schedule anything. So it works really well. And then you have a voice note and a PDF and some recommended like ways to kind of journal or engage with it, or and so it can be a really beautiful part of your New Year ritual if that speaks to you. So so I think we'll like I said, leave that there for today. So I'd love to hear what you think, like if you've experienced that. I've heard some people call it shaman sickness before, or shaman sick, like kind of that like I traveled to the other world and back and now my body's having a physical response. But this phenomenon of getting sick after a peak experience, have you experienced that before, and how was that for you? And did this conversation help illuminate anything? I'd love to hear. So in the meantime, I hope you have a beautiful solstice, or are having a beautiful sort of solstice portal, and are finding at least little moments where you can drop into sort of the essentialism of the season, and that your holiday is beautiful, and that even in moments where you may not be fully physically well, that your heart and your heart and your spirit feel held and feel nourished and feel well, and offering up massive prayers for Palestine and Gaza, and just and all the places in the world right now where there's just massive hurt happening and not a lot of attention and care. And may we all just maybe I'll feel our hearts more this year. So thank you for being with me on this journey. Thank you for hopefully staying with me through this episode with my rough voice and my coughing fits. And I appreciate you. So be well. And until next time around the fire, may it be so.
Hi, Kate here again. Thank you for gathering with us. Whether you've been here a while or found your way here thanks to today's guest, it means so much to me and the world I dream of to have you here. I hope you'll tune in for more of our conversations. We humans seem to be at a profound threshold and facing questions of deep impact for the future and the world. We need our full hearts and humanity as we sow seeds of change in these times of joy and heartbreak. I count myself lucky to be here now, around this virtual village fire, weaving our stories into a medicine with humans like you. As a community medicine space, this podcast is relational. It weaves webs of connection and mutual respect and care across time and space. If you appreciate and support the future we're seeding here, you can support the weaving of this web in a few ways. 1, share episodes with friends and family or online with your community. It also helps the podcast immensely if you like, rate, subscribe to, or follow the podcast where you watch or listen, so you get notified when new episodes drop and new listeners find us as they search. 2, join us on Patreon. Doing so supports conversations like the one you just heard and allows you access to live community gatherings and medicine circles and more as we continue to grow. It also helps me keep the space advertisement-free so the conversations stay intact as they are. If you have questions, suggestions, connections, or would like to find out more about working with me, you can find me online at www.wildsacredjourney.com, on Instagram at wildsacredjourney_KP, or email me, kate@wildsacredjourney.com. Until next time, From my heart to yours, I release today's fire with a prayer for our individual and collective wholeness, connection, and joy. May it be so.